Right on. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our conversation this evening. I'm so glad everyone could make it. I'm JC. I'll be kind of emceeing, handling the chat, and introducing our lovely panelists today. We have two ASL interpreters, Cheryl and Keisha. If you would like ASL interpretation, you can pin them to your screen. Thank you, both of you, for being here. Very generous. And we have Miko and Malvika doing closed captions. So if you'd like subtitles, you can click the closed caption button in the bottom toolbar, and those will be appearing as the conversation goes on. Just some basic housekeeping. We're going to be recording for the Rail archives, so if you would not like to be recorded, you can turn your video off with the little camera icon in the bottom left. The team will be kind of providing links that may come up in the conversation in the chat bar, which you can open. And if you have any questions for the Q&A, you can direct message them to either me or to Sophia or anyone who's a co-host. Sophia is there, and the Rail team is kind of around helping. We're going to help keep things running smoothly. You can hit us up with tech questions as well if things are malfunctioning. We have an amazing panel today, including Nadja Eisenberg-Guyot, pronouns they and them. Nadja is an abolitionist organizer, teacher, and graduate student in NYC. We also have Jarrod Shanahan, pronouns he and him, who's an assistant professor of criminal justice at Governor State University in Illinois. And we have Kei Williams, pronouns he, him, they, and them, a queer, transmasculine identified designer, writer, and public speaker, organizer, activist, and they're all super pros. We also have Kevin Steele, who was unable to join us because he is down with his family with poor service. So we'll be playing pre-recorded question and answers with him throughout the conversation. And Stevie could not be here, Stevie Wilson. But we also had a call with Stevie, and we'll be reading his answers to his comments on the topic as we move forward. With that, I think I can just turn it over to the panel if y'all are ready to take it away.
Yeah, so I guess I can kick it off and introduce myself. My name is Kei. I use he and they pronouns, and I am organizer. Am I supposed to be doing this right now? Am I on the right agenda item? Great, awesome. Yeah, okay. My name is Kei. As I said, he and they pronouns. I'm currently the national organizer for the Marsha B. Johnson Institute. I also am one of the founding members of Black Lives Matter. And so that's a little bit about my history and who I am. And I'll pass to Jarrod.
Hi, Jarrod Shanahan, abolitionist activist scholar. I'm currently an assistant professor at Governor State University out here in Illinois.
Hey everyone, I'm Nadja. I use they, them pronouns. I'm so grateful to be on this panel with Jarrod and Kei, who I both know from the past couple years of organizing against the New York City jail expansion plan. I also wanted to provide a little bit more of an introduction for the two other voices who can't be on the panel with us today. So the first person is Stevie Wilson, who uses he, him pronouns. Stevie is a Black, queer, imprisoned abolitionist organizer who believes that political education behind the walls should be supported and expanded. This political education helps us to understand the hows and whys of our lives, and without political education, we will continue to be stymied in our efforts to dismantle the PIC. So Stevie was hoping to be on the call, to be able to call into the panel today, but he's currently imprisoned in Pennsylvania, and all the prisons in Pennsylvania, including the one where Stevie is currently held captive, are on lockdown, and incarcerated people are currently only being allowed 45 minutes outside of their cells each day, during which they must choose between hygiene, personal hygiene, cleaning their cells, recreation, and making phone calls. In addition, Stevie is facing arbitrary repression for his political activities, including recently writing in support of the hunger and labor strikes currently ongoing on Rikers Island in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. So we were able to email Stevie some questions at the beginning of the week, and throughout the panel, we're going to be reading some of his answers to those questions. I'd also just like to share that if you'd like to support Stevie, you can visit his website, which is maintained by outside organizers, and that's Abolitionist Study at wordpress.com. And you can subscribe to his Patreon and follow him on Twitter at Agitate and Organize and Study Abolition. The other person who can't be on the panel with us today, but whose voice you will be hearing, is Kevin Steele, who is an organizer with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee and the campaign to bring Mumia home. Kevin was incarcerated during the 2016 National Prison Strike and organized inside prison in conjunction with that strike, and was an outside organizer during the 2018 prison strike. And as was mentioned, he's currently in Georgia with his sister and his son and without access to internet, but we're going to be hearing from him as well during the course of the panel. So let's get into it.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess I'll jump in. And again, thank you everybody for being here and joining the call. We're really excited to just get to share these ideals and the work that we've been doing with you guys and also with each other. I think that a lot of that building has been happening of figuring out who's been doing what work and what that looks like. So yeah, I just think that the first question that's important to ask is to Nadja and Jarrod, more so for you, for starters, is you guys wrote this article called "All Jails Fit to Build" and in the Brooklyn Row, and just wondering how did the ideal for this article come about?
Go ahead, Jarrod.
Well, Nadja contacted me and said, hey, the New York Times just came out in support of the new jails in New York, the massive jail expansion. Why don't we write an article that chronicles all the other jails that the New York Times has supported over the years? And so we had to do a little bit of research, and it turned out the answer is just about most of them. And so what began as an angry letter to the New York Times took on kind of a life of its own, right, Nadja?
Yeah, absolutely. The New York Times endorsed Mayor Bill de Blasio's jails expansion plan about a week before City Council voted yes. And I was furious. And so I messaged Jarrod and was like, we have to do something about this. And as Jarrod is saying, you don't have to dig very far in the archives to see how much liberals love a good jail construction plan. And so this article outlines that history.
Yeah, liberals love a good jail construction plan. Jarrod, do you want to take us through the general argument of the article?
Sure, and Nadja, please hop in at any time. Beginning in the 1860s, we told a story that is largely cyclical. It begins when the New York Times decries the barbaric conditions of X, Y, or Z carceral facility, advocating for a replacement of that facility with a new and more humane jail rooted in all of the most modern carceral science, penology, and all the rest. Step is, in shorter, the new facilities become just as bad as the old ones, and the New York Times rushes in by sensationalizing how bad these conditions are. In the typical journalistic account in this vein portrays the suffering and the misery of people locked up in these facilities to a largely middle-class audience, does not emphasize resistance from bottom up, and instead represents these people who are locked in these terrible jails as needing salvation from above. And so this sets in motion the same process all over again, where the problems of the old jail are addressed by creating a new one. And it's really remarkable how many times this story has played out in New York City alone. Nadja, what would you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think another important to emphasize in history is how for these liberal reformers, the crisis of dehumanization, violence, and brutality in existing jails can be solved through technocratic or design measures, right? So we can architecture somehow our way out of the brutalization of incarcerated people. So over and again in these accounts of the New York Times extolling these new jail facilities, you get descriptions that you would expect to see in the architecture or design section of a newspaper, talking about jails, using metaphors and analogies to women's colleges and hotels, suggesting that the facilities of incarceration are perhaps even nicer than the conditions that incarcerated people deserve. So we should all be on board and behind the project to build these new facilities. And so that's another thing we call in the article is the kind of the use of this design-based or technocratic language, which really conceals, of course, that the brutality of jails is about the social relations inside them primarily, and about the relations of criminalization, violence, and white supremacy that produce the carceral state in the first place.
Yeah, well said, Nadja. So at this point, maybe we can do a little check-in on terminology. So we've been talking a lot about liberal reformers, and there are a lot of studies out in recent years that lay mass incarceration at the feet not only of the right-wingers, but also liberal reformers. And so I was wondering, Kei and Nadja, you could say a little bit about what we mean when we refer to liberal reformers.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we need to consider when we're looking at abolition, especially as it gets more popular, but also as you guys talked about, this ideal of reshaping the carceral state or redesigning the facilities or just adding in extra resources, be that programs, be that therapy, be that whatever type of, current modern holistic language is kind of being populated in the world. And so when it comes to liberal reformists, what you have are like people who are like, believe that they're really radical, who really believe that they're doing the most radical thing possible, but not actually disrupting or destroying or transforming the system. Most often the decisions are made by liberal reformists or reformists in general, either definitely like continues and sustains that, if not expands. And more often we see that there's an expansion as the processes continue to go. And so, I think that you will always hear people talking about the possibilities of the good, right? The possibilities of just making these small shifts, these small tweaks. And most scholars know, and as was noted over time, there's never been a creation of a jail that was good or that was humane, or just making these small changes that would make a huge shift. And so, scholars, abolitionists, Ruthie Gilmore, Angela Davis, even some of our translators, Miss Major, like really people who experienced the jail system saying like, nope, this is not it. And I think that it requires us to always push people beyond what they're considering. And I think that that is one of the most important things is that you'll have people who are literally like, think that they're the most progressive people doing the right thing. And I think one of the things that I think about is like how liberal reform, especially when it comes to the PIC, the prison industrial complex, like how they can fall into both buckets of like people who are conservative, who are like really attached to white supremacy and really attached to incarcerated people, and you can have people who are considered really progressive, like Bill de Blasio, who are like actually designing and promoting jail extension, right? And so I feel like reform and liberalism in this context can happen on both sides of that political spectrum. Nadja, do you want to add anything to a liberal reformist when it comes to prison reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really hit it on the head that people on the left or liberals like to like to lay responsibility for the prison industrial complex at the feet of conservatives, at the feet of quote unquote law and order Republicans, right? And like to trace the origins of mass incarceration to that trend in governance. But what many abolitionists have noted over the past 100 years is that jail reform, prison reform are actually progressive projects. They're undertaken by liberals who think that we can make these facilities more humane, as Kei's saying, more rehabilitative, more responsive somehow to the needs of oppressed and marginalized people. And they're often justifying the expansion of the carceral state, not through a punitive logic on its face, but through a rehabilitative logic. And yet, what we end up arriving at is the same expansion of the carceral state that you would get from law and order conservatives who just want to punish people. And so the other component that I think is important to name in a liberal project is how jail reformers treat interpersonal harm or interpersonal violence as the result of individuals, right? Which is an inherently liberal project. Individuals with responsibilities and rights harm other individuals and then must be deprived of their liberty, right? Whereas a radical perspective on the prison industrial complex recognizes that interpersonal violence always happens in the context of white supremacy, happens in the context of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and heteropatriarchy. And so if we actually want to address interpersonal violence and harm, we have to address those structural conditions. But liberals treat those things as problems of individuals and then use the prison industrial complex to target those individuals for presumptive rehabilitation rather than addressing any of those structural concerns. So I was hoping that you, Kei and Jarrod, could talk a little bit more about that history of liberal reform in a local New York City context, given that much of the histories that scholars have traced have been kind of at the national level.
Yeah, I think that looking at reform in New York State, particularly, like when we look at New York State and even New York City, most of the economy of upstate New York depends on prisons and jails in order to sustain itself. And so that New York is not unique in the sense that it has built up this empire. We see this happening all the time around the carceral state settling problems. But I think what's like something that I often talk about or think about is the fact that the response to poverty or individuals with social issues or interpersonal issues, the response in New York has overwhelmingly always been to incarcerate, if not incarcerate, institutionalize people. And so a lot of what we see with penal colonies or even penal islands, or you see, we talk about Blackwell a little bit in the construction of Blackwell, really coming from this need to solve poverty, right? Like what are we gonna do with the poor people who are in our streets, who are, it's the same thing with the homeless population who are in the subway. It's the same exact concept historically in New York. So a lot doesn't change over time other than the building or the argument around the current issue. I would say that historically New York is really obsessed with a institutionalized industrialization of punishment. And I think that because, especially globally, we are this epicenter of so many different things that it's a little bit irresponsible for us to continue to have attachment to this legacy. But automating poverty, which, when we talk about prison industrial complex, we're talking about surveillance. We're talking about the things that go beyond actual cages or incarcerating people in buildings. We're talking about probation. We're talking about parole. We're talking about all the different ways in which the state reaches out and has its tentacles and its fingers into the everyday people, everyday lives of people. But for me, one of the main points that I always try to start at is this response to poverty. And that, New York even being the epicenter of the war on drugs, right? And so we just tend to respond to things historically with this, we can tweak this thing for the better. And often the tweaking and the guidance and the leadership is not done. It's not led by people who are impacted or those who have been incarcerated, right? But this outside entity like the New York Times coming in and saying, we as an editorial board of the New York Times know what's best for incarcerated people. So, so Jarrod, if you want to add on to anything I just said.
I mean, you've mostly said it all, Kei. I guess I would just really emphasize that the liberal reforms are in New York City are almost always framed within a kind of callous pragmatism that assumes that uh, most people in the city will remain relatively powerless over the conditions of their own lives, and that their lives are to be administered largely by the police, the justice system, or one of the ancillary human services, the welfare, you name it, and it is within this framework in which the police have assumed, of course, an increasing and ever-growing role in the last 40 years that reformers attempt to solve social problems through the individual rehabilitation and through individual interventions conducted largely within the broader context of police management of social reproduction. And so this is a far cry from taking steps to encourage people to take control over the conditions of their own lives. And it actually exposes a lot of the middle class history of social work and of the nonprofit industrial complex, which oftentimes speak the same way that we're speaking right now, but their horizon is very much within the context of keeping people in this box where the main decisions of their lives are not made by them, they are made for them. And so I think it would belabor the point to go any further than that. I believe we have a recording from Kevin, who was asked a similar question, and I think we're going to hear that right now.
Hey, Kevin, how are you?
I'm fine. Everything's good.
Thanks so much for agreeing to be on this panel tonight. I'm sorry you couldn't be on the Zoom, but we're really grateful to have your voice in the conversation. So our first question for you is, what are your thoughts on the liberal idea of a so-called humane or rehabilitative or modern jail?
Yeah, my thoughts, that's like, it's ironic. It's like, as if saying, rehabilitated slave plantation. It's not something that's possible. It's not possible to have a place that was built and formed for enslaved people and for runaway slaves, and try to somehow miraculously transform that into something that could be positive. That's not realistic. And just like seeing the conditions and the mindset of the guards inside there and the conditions of the enslaved people that's inside there, it's not possible for there to be, especially not in this country, it's not possible for it to be a humane prison, a humane jail cell, because of how the capitalist works, how the capitalist mind works. It would never be a place where they won't use cheap labor to help thrive the country. But it's just not realistic to try to sit here and try to figure out how do we shut down Rikers Island, open up little nice jails. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all.
It's completely incoherent, the concept, because of the origins of incarceration and what it's meant to do.
Exactly.
Word, yeah. I want to thank you, Nadja, for having that conversation and for grabbing that and making sure that his voice is still being heard. But yeah, we also, as Nadja mentioned earlier, we wrote to Stevie and asked him, what are your thoughts on the liberal ideal of a quote unquote humane or rehabilitative or modern jail, right? So as I said, the language around that is generally used. And so pretty much the same question that we asked Kevin, and I'm gonna have Jarrod read Stevie's answer.
Thank you. And yes, thanks again for collecting censor. It's so powerful. I'll read it. So Stevie says, There's no such thing. The only people who use such phrases are those who have never been forced to live in cages. To me, it's an oxymoron, and we're talking about rehabilitative jails here. To me, it's an oxymoron. It's like asking about humane alienation or rehabilitative oppression. What so many people don't understand is that prison is not only a physical site, but also a relationship. People tend to focus on the physical site only and forget there are relationships that prison creates. There are power dynamics that imprisonment engenders. These power dynamics, these relationships, do not change because the cage is new and shiny. Officers and staff are trained to see imprisoned folks as subhuman. Our society conditions us and rewards us for marginalizing certain groups of people. That conditioning and reward system is intensified in prison. I am currently housed in a new prison. I was formerly housed in a prison built in 1879. In both sites, the relationship created by imprisonment doesn't change. I am still seen by officers as subhuman, and many prisoners too, because of my sexuality and race. This view of me dictates how I am treated, not the newness of the cage.
Thank you so much for Jarrod and Kei for setting up that space for Stevie's voice to come through in this conversation. So we've been talking a lot about how liberal reformers are behind the expansion of mass incarceration, both nationally and in New York City specifically. And so we want to turn the conversation now to talk about abolition and its history and practice in New York. So for as long as liberals and conservatives have invested in oppression, Black and brown people, Indigenous people, working class people, and queer people have organized and fought back. So Kei, what does that abolitionist history look like in New York City?
Yeah, and so one of the projects that I work on is called Black Gotham Experience, and what we do is we focus on the beginning of New York City from the 1600s pretty much forward. And as an organizer, I take the lens of the work that we do, and I always apply it as an organizer and an activist lens. And so some of the things that, just touch on the history of New York is that, that in 1712, just as a frame reference, on April 6, 1712, it was the first organized New York slave rebellion here in New York City, where about 30 enslaved people who were also people who are indigenous and poor white folks gathered together in what is lower Manhattan now and rebelled against Wall Street. And the reason why they were rebelling against Wall Street was just 6 months prior, November 1711, the New York City government and New York State had made a requirement that anybody who wanted to auction or sell or rent an enslaved person had to do so on Wall Street. And at the time, Wall Street is an actual market. So there's a butcher market, there's a grain and wheat stand, all the things that you need. And on the plaque, they write all the things that you would need that's crucial to a colonial diet, right? So they kind of write this thing up in terms of like, hey, we sell people, but we also sell corn and grain at the same site. Like, it's not a big deal. And so it really is this commonization of like enslavement in New York, which looks completely different than we think about in the South. Really important to that is because the enslaved Black folks that have been brought to New York from Congo, from Angola, and also from the West Indies are here building up the city. And so Trinity Church is built by some of the first enslaved people here brought from the Dutch. Wall Street is actually an actual wall that's built. Broadway is the longest street in New York, and it was already a trail that was created by the Lenape people, who are the indigenous people of New York, right? And all of this comes to a head as the British are here and taking over and starting to cut back on rights for enslaved people. 1643, slaves could eventually buy their freedom or gain their freedom and actually own land. So like in 1643, there was the Land of the Blacks, which is currently where Washington Square Park is and NYU's campus. You won't find a plaque highlighting that, right? And so you think about that. So the British are taking away property. They are coming up with laws that say you cannot gather in groups larger than 3, that you cannot entertain in the homes with free Black people, and enslaved Black people can't gather together in their homes. So all these like slave laws are happening and coming up, which eventually would bubble up and lead to the second New York conspiracy in 1741. And that's a conspiracy that's built together where a series of fires are set across the city by enslaved people in order to basically rebel. And kind of bringing this full out, 1776, we all know that year. But at the time of the American Revolution, New York City had the second slave population, only second to South Carolina. Right, so you talk about the amount of enslaved people living in New York City at the peak of the American Revolution is second to South Carolina. And then I think this is something that Jarrod touches on and goes into in your article as well. It's like 1860s, there's these carceral facilities that are built. But true abolition doesn't happen in New York until about 1845. And so you think about it, New York City is created in 1664. It's 1845 where slavery actually is abolished. That's 200 years. And then shortly after that, you have the creation of the first institutions and the first carceral buildings in New York to kind of go ahead and do that process. And after these different rebellions that are happening, the laws only get worse. And the reason why I call these rebellions, and also why I connected to organizing, is that you had enslaved people going right up against the policies and the laws that were criminalizing them. And so, for example, if a law in 1712 is people can't gather in groups larger than 3, and we gather in the middle of the night with 30 of us, we're breaking a law. If enslaved people cannot own weapons or utilize weapons, and we're there in a rebellion and we're armed with swords and machetes and musket guns, right? We're rebelling against these principles and these practices that are being installed. But it's really important for folks to understand that New York City is based in slave labor, that the city is named after slave traders. And that even after abolition came, that there was then the investment in Wall Street, investment in sugar and cotton plantations in the South. And a lot of our train stations in New York City are actually named after slave owners and slave traders. So I'll stop there and just kind of frame that. But looking at abolition here is that even though there is this discomforts happening, there's no record, for example, of Black people and Indigenous people ever getting into wars with each other. There was solidarity in that space, and even working class people, that they would organize together and come together. And even women, 2 of the rebels in the 1712 war were Black women, one who was believed to be pregnant. So we think about the risk and the things that people take historically, specifically here in New York, to combat that oppression, that repression, and this institutionalization and this taking away of rights, which comes only after people know about rights and know about freedoms. And so think about being incarcerated, where you know the freedom of the world outside, you know to come and go, you know when you can eat, you know all these basic principles and freedoms that you have taken away. And that would happen in New York on a massive scale, where not only are you enslaving people, but you're auctioning and renting them out on Wall Street, on a market, every single day, and up to 7,000 African people were brought here directly to New York City to be sold into slavery.
Thank you for all that, Kei. I'm afraid you're not off the hook quite yet, because you've spoken a lot about the history of slavery and abolition in New York City, and I was hoping, as kind of another terminological check-in, you could clarify what it means to be an abolitionist today, and how that is built on the tradition that you just described.
Yeah, one of the things that I say whenever I'm talking about abolition is that when it came time to abolish slavery, they didn't just build new plantations. And so that's kind of how I make a connecting line to now the prison industrial complex and abolition, which I like to refer to critical resistance and their definitions. I believe that language is really important. And I believe that people having something to function with when you come to something that people consider as abstract as abolition is important. And so, prison industrial complex is a term, this is from Critical Resistance website, a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And so abolition is, a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. And I think that that's really important, because we here, especially with the jail expansion plan, very much well, what are we gonna do? Where are we gonna put the bad people? And it's there's this limitation about imagining what abolition can actually look like. And it's not just about destroying cages and just about tearing down the buildings. It's also about looking at the society in which we live in, and looking at how the system feeds itself to maintain oppression and inequalities through this punishment system that we've been talking about. And it's a very wide strategy. And I think that both parts is that, you use it as organizing, but also an overall transformative goal. And the connection between kind of slavery and abolition, besides the, like what Kevin kind of talked about a little bit around slave patrols turning eventually into police officers, and plantations turning into prisons and jails. But you would have these small series of rebellions that would lead up, what we call Caesar's Rebellion of 1741, the Haitian Rebellion that happened, Harriet Tubman's, even her radicalization of abolition, that you would see the need to organize people, but also have a vision for the aftermath of what things can become. And I think a lot of what, at least for me, influences abolition from a framework of talking about prisons and jails comes from incarcerated people. And I think that, yes, Angela Davis, but I also love to honor Fred Jackson, who really led a lot of work in the freedom fighters and Attica, and even our current freedom fighters today, Stevie, who are really holding down that work and taking leadership from the inside out. And I think that that pretty much is really core to anything, is that you always have to have people who are the most directly impacted leading that work, but we all have to have a vision to work collectively together. And so the overlap between organizing and abolition is kind of, for me, pretty sweet, because you're dreaming of a more beautiful, powerful world where we don't require cages in order to remedy any issues, knowing that incarceration leads to more violence. And so we need to think in that big way to think about how things can be different. And I think to wrap it up is like living this in our everyday lives as abolitionists. And a lot of abolitionists will try to practice that in any way possible. So yeah, I hope that was like really helpful. And, to kind of wrap up kind of this idea around history and practices in New York and what that looks like, and I'm going to throw this to Nadja. Sometimes we meet folks who say, sure, that sounds good in theory, but what about the problems that we have here and now? What about the rapists and the murderers? How do abolitionists propose to address violence and keep vulnerable people safe?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kei. I've never heard it before. I'm kidding. So one of the first ways I always like to answer that question is to ask if we think the prison industrial complex is actually addressing violence now, right? So what I would say to that is no, the prison industrial complex is not a solution to violence. What it does is displace violence. It doesn't fix violence, it doesn't end violence, it doesn't solve violence, it displaces violence. And police, jails, and prisons are some of the largest purveyors of all of the kinds of violence in our society that we're most worried about, from interpersonal violence to sexual violence to racial violence to transphobic violence. Those things are intensified and produced by the prison industrial complex. So the system we currently have doesn't keep vulnerable people safe. It doesn't address violence. It displaces violence. And it uses the massive power of the state, right, to quarantine, contain, and control people in institutions that are organized precisely around the kinds of violences that we are most worried about, right? Racial violence, sexual violence, transphobic violence, ableist violence. So if we really wanted to address that kind of violence in our society, we would need to stop. We would need to start by eliminating the prison industrial complex. We would need to start by eliminating police. We would need to start by eliminating jailing. We would need to start by eliminating prisons, right? Because sexual violence is rampant in prison. Racial violence is rampant in prison. So the first thing I always like to say is that, in fact, the prison industrial complex doesn't address violence. And so then we have to ask about the alternatives, right? And there are so many, from mediation to conflict resolution to violence interruption to restorative justice to transformative justice. And the fact of the matter is, the prison industrial complex, policing, incarceration, mass incarceration, doesn't have any evidence base behind it. Criminologists have been trying to prove for centuries that policing and jailing makes us safer. That's literally what criminology exists to do, is to prove that fact. And they've been unable to do it. Criminologists have been unable to prove that. The evidence, yet abolitionists who say things like violence interruption works are being subjected to rigorous, repeated studies on the efficacy of some of these programs. And it turns out violence interruption, for example, is shown to reduce interpersonal conflict and gun violence in neighborhoods where it exists. It massively times more than policing does, right? So the evidence base already exists for alternatives, right? And then the final thing that I would say is that, and we really did a lot of this work, you and I, Kei, when we were fighting for the first couple of years against the New York City jail expansion plan, is if you write to someone in prison and you ask them, what would you do to close Rikers without building new jails? You don't have to be an abolitionist to say, and many of the people we wrote to in prison weren't, we need better housing, we need better schools, we need to solve the crisis of homelessness, we need to give people mental health treatment, we need to give them education for liberation, not for oppression, we need to give youth safe programs to go to after school, we need to give people role models so they feel like they're valuable, right? The fact of the matter is the prison industrial complex treats Black and brown people, Indigenous people, working class people, people with disabilities, trans and gender nonconforming people, as though they're worthless, that they have no value. And if we invested as a society in treating all of us like we have value, interpersonal harm and violence in our society would decrease. It's a simple equation. And when you ask people in jail and prison, what are your solutions to violence? Those are the kinds of things they talk about. And I just wanted to mention one other thing, and then I'll throw it back to you, Kei, is that we have this imaginary that victims are on one side and perpetrators are on the other. But if you look at rates of quote unquote victimization or survivorhood, people who are currently incarcerated are more likely to have survived violence than people outside. So we're perpetually punishing survivors of violence through mass incarceration. So our criminal legal system and our punishment system don't serve survivors well either. And there are many ways of talking about how survivors are failed by the criminal legal system. But if we really cared about keeping vulnerable people safe, we would invest in these alternatives. And I know, Kei, you have a lot to share on that.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I was wondering if we are going to do, if we wanted to plug in Kevin's response around abolition and the same type of framing of question as well.
Our next question is, what does abolitionist organizing mean to you? Who do we organize with? Where do we start? What does it feel like to do abolitionist organizing?
It feels great. First, let me start with that. It's way more freedom, and for me, it's more fun than trying to be a reformist, honestly. That's just like, I think reform has too much, it has too many shackles on it, and it's not real. Not saying that reform isn't real, but the movement is not real. But so abolition organizing for me, it allows me to get on panels like this and say what the hell I want to say, right? It allows me to not confine my words and confine how my thoughts and feelings, and not always look for the politically right answer. And it allows me to really stir stuff up, right? Really make a change has to do with abolition, right? Reform is just a pacified way of trying to make change, and we're not babies, right? We did that. We did that in the 60s. We did that in the 50s and 70s. We had baby steps. It's no longer time to continue to try to do what we want things. We did that already. Now I think we all should be abolitionists. We all should try to change the established, right? Like, we should really put our focus on it. Like, so that's what it means to me. Where it's like, I'm young, so obviously, but I read a lot on that era, so I'm tired of trying to take baby steps in that way. So I think it's the only way to do it.
Right. So to bring this up to the present and the kind of context of our article, so the past few years we've seen an intense fight about the future of incarceration in New York City in particular, but also lots of other places. So I'm gonna ask Kei first. What's been going on in New York City? How have abolitionists been organizing and how have they been fighting back?
Yeah, so as not just mentioned, I think a couple other folks have hinted at, is that New York City proposed a jail expansion plan, which would cost $11 billion, building 4 new mega jails, the tallest jails in the world, and without a guarantee to close Rikers Island. And so it was this really hard fought battle, I would say, and it was a really intense fight where we had to go through the serious process of a ULURP. And I think that one of the things that early on organizers and activists realized was that the city was utilizing a vehicle that was not proper or incorrect in any way to at least hold a container of a conversation around expanding jails or even anything dealing with incarcerated people. But the city decided to use the ULURP process, which is the universal land use process, to determine that the city would have rights to operate this plot of land as jails. And so the first part we had to go through was the City Planning Commission, which kind of went over the design and the scale. And it was really, I think, disturbing and in a lot of ways when we first jumped into the fight, and a little bit jarring and shocking to have people talk about these jails as if they were condos. To say that, on the bottom of the jails, we're going to have 20,000 square feet for retail services. We're going to have coffee shops and yoga studios. Like a yoga studio was actually proposed by the Brooklyn borough president. And so just thinking about these different ways in which the state and the city were invested in building these new jails. And so a group of organizers and abolitionists came together. The campaign that I and most of us are most familiar with here in New York is No New Jails, NYC. And I think that one of the most beautiful things about the way that No New Jails came together, along with other long-term standing organizations such as Critical Resistance, such as Survive and Punish, I Walk Rap, you had all these groups coming together in this way. You also had other groups on the other side touching a little bit on, earlier around this liberal reformist thing, who were these huge nonprofits. You had Ford come out with a letter saying that they supported the need to build new jails. All these other huge funders getting on board. And so you really saw this real toe-to-toe history, this toe-to-toe fight between abolitionists who are fighting against these 4 new jails, but also providing a lot of information along the way. And I think there's a couple of things that I'm really proud of in regards to the campaign and being an abolitionist. Definitely, I think, is one of the most prideful things that you can do, because you're actually fighting for a better world for everybody. There is, and it's about as much reduction of harm, as much reduction as violence, and breaking down, dismantling systems to prevent these things from happening again, right? And I think that these are the things that we touched on as we were building this campaign. A couple of different methods of strategy came out, and I think that touching on some of them is really important, that there were things that were built up, such as mutual aid, where folks were saying hey, we're going to bail some people out and we need to ensure that they have food, or that this Black trans woman needs rent, or just these very intentional ways that we were building community, having commissary drives, having letter writing parties and events. That was one way that we were building with people, because it was really important for us to not just come out as abolitionists, but again, to talk to people who are directly inside and invite them to organize with us. And for us to actually to organize with them, right? To not just kind of come in and say, here's what's happening, but to honestly be let's organize, let's build together. We want you to get out, and we know that once you get out, you want to live in the type of world that we want to live in. So let's make this work together. And I think we did a lot of political education, not just around ULURP, but about the ins and outs of this jail plan. And we went toe-to-toe with a lot of different groups and a lot of different people who were and we'll touch on this a little bit later, but co-opting some of the language that abolitionists were using, and it's just a variety of different tactics, targeting politicians, be it like going to their offices and like calling them out, or going ham on Twitter. Which like super shout out to Sophia, who's on the call, who like even to this day will go ham to ham and call out some of our elected officials on Twitter and like do that work. And I think that even though, to like bring it to present, the city did vote to approve the new jail plan on October 17th. So you had a very weird champion of this horrible plan coming through from Mayor Bill de Blasio and from Speaker Corey Johnson, really saying like, oh, wow, we're really going to close Rikers. Like, it was just this really weird, I think, space to like have this happening in. And one of the things that, I was worried about as far as being in New York is, one, a very common abolitionist thing is if they build it, they will fill it. And with no guarantee to close Rikers Island, with this huge investment in these new jails at $11 billion, but also all of the city's plans having an asterisk next to it. So now you have organizers who had to deal with some of this pushback, having to live the realities of our people continuing to get incarcerated. But it also has built a really strong, solid momentum where I think you cannot talk about jail expansion in New York City without talking about abolition, without talking about abolitionists in some way. And there's been a change in that conversation, and the work in No New Jails was influenced and then went on to influence other groups to launch No New Jails campaign. So there's No New Jails in DC, No New Jails in New Orleans, a lot of groups coming together to push back against this jail expansion plan that's actually becoming very popular and trendy across the US. Yeah, and so like I touched on this a little bit, and I want to like kind of throw this back to Nadja at first to talk about some of the co-opting of radical language that we've seen, especially as how it relates to the jail construction fight. So some of the co-optation and also some of the critiques that abolitionists faced when we were going up against for the construction strike. And and overall the dangers that we're seeing of abolition becoming mainstream.
Yeah, so liberals are really slippery, right? So a lot of them are talking the language that we're talking about wanting to reduce harm, wanting to reduce interpersonal violence, wanting a society with a lower rate of incarceration, right? And so it's really a twisted logic, but de Blasio was selling a massive jail construction and expansion plan in New York City as a plan for decarceration. And it's so important to emphasize what Kei already said, right? Which is that this jails construction plan was being sold as a plan to close Rikers without any legally binding guarantee that Rikers would close. And indeed, there's still no legally binding guarantee that Rikers will close. Yet they voted to build new jails, and they're on the way to building them. And what we're seeing right now in this moment, just as a little aside, with the rollbacks to bail reform. So the New York State passed a bail reform law that took effect on January 1st. It was a reformist reform. It did not eliminate pretrial detention, which is the abolitionist demand always is to end pretrial detention, not just end cash bail. But those reforms have just been rolled back. And so New York City is now left with the entire capacity of Rikers Island to incarcerate, plus potentially the capacity of all of these new state-of-the-art jails. And also, as Kei said, if a city is going to spend $11 billion on new jails, you best believe they're going to use them to incarcerate, right? This is the largest capital project that New York has invested in since the WPA. Jarrod, you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but this is a massive expansion, a massive capital expense putting towards mass incarceration. Yet, it's being sold as a solution to mass incarceration. De Blasio is a fan of saying, New York City didn't start mass incarceration, but we're going to end it. He's wrong on both counts. New York State did invent mass incarceration with the Rockefeller drug laws, and we're certainly not ending it by producing these new jails. But what we are seeing is liberals using many of the terms that abolitionists have used to argue against jail construction, to somehow argue for it. And that's been a real struggle, I think. And Kei, I mean, I think many of us have answers to this question, but one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how it's never enough to shift the terms of the conversation if you're not shifting the material conditions, if you're not building power. And Jarrod, I get this from you, but you say nothing is going to change how the police state treats people with no power other than building up their power. And so something I think we've seen over the past year in New York is liberals having to reckon with the language of abolition, but not the substance, right? Not actually transferring material resources to abolitionist projects. And so also for me, that's the easy way to tell when a liberal is just co-opting the language of abolition. What are they funding, right? What are they expanding? As they say things like, we're ending mass incarceration, what are they building? And if they're not divesting from mass criminalization and investing in social programs and violence interruption, then you know them by that lack of congruence between what they say and what they do. But Jarrod, please jump in.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Nadja. I mean, on the one hand, it's a good thing when your politics go mainstream, right? It provides a lot of opportunities to speak to a larger audience. I mean, the problem is that this is usually accompanied by a complete evacuation of any of the substance, specifically the material substance. And so this is something that my colleague Jana Kurti and I have looked at a lot around the language of what some folks call carceral humanism that's built into the plan for the new jails, and that underwrites a lot of the kind of nonprofit organizations that contributed to the plan for the new jails. And carceral humanism, I think you described it very well, so I won't belabor the point. Recasts the human caging in terms taken from social work, from human services and all the rest, using sometimes comically Orwellian language to refer to prisons, detention centers, and so forth as rehabilitative centers. I think the new jails are going to be called justice hubs. It's completely absurd. And so we can see where a lot of this kind of liberatory language can get repurposed, right? I believe there was an op-ed in the Daily News around the time that the new jails were coming to vote that was chiding the abolitionists in No New Jails for being bad abolitionists for wanting to stop the jail. Of course, if they understood the three-dimensional chess of abolition strategy, you would want to build new jails to abolish jails anyway. But to all of this kind of is kind of almost comical rhetoric. It would be comical if it didn't have such dire consequences in people's lives. But to this rhetoric, I mean, you can say, hic Rhodus, hic Salta, here's the jail system, let's fucking abolish it, right? And adding on to it and building new facilities, new human cages is the opposite, right? And so I mean, it's a dangerous moment, but there's a lot of potential to pull things in our direction. So let's see. Yeah, and so actually we posed this question to Stevie, saying, how do we fight against the state's massive power to co-opt and de-radicalize liberation movements? So we have about 50 years of American history built into that question. Okay. And Kei, you want to read Stevie's answer?
Yeah, sure. So Stevie responds, if people would stop listening to those who have no or very little incarceration experience and began to focus on the concerns of people currently incarcerated and their families, the priorities of the movement, especially as promoted by liberal nonprofits, would be very different. As long as the quote-unquote experts at these nonprofits are allowed to dictate and dominate the narrative, we will get more of the same. Censor the voices of those most impacted and see what we get. When these nonprofits step up to the mic, ask them who they are connected to inside. Ask them to amplify the concerns of those at the most concentrated point of the prison industrial complex. Ask them whom are they speaking with and for. And we also have a recorded answer from Kevin answering the same exact question on the co-optation of abolition.
How do we fight against the state's massive power to co-opt and de-radicalize liberation movements?
Can you ask that again?
How do we fight against the state's massive power to co-opt and de-radicalize liberation movements?
So
like, yeah.
No, go ahead, finish.
You go.
Oh, yeah, so the way we fight back is through organizing and really unity. That's the basics, right? That's the simplest form is to really unionize, to enslave people on the inside and outside as well, and to really strategize, come up with a strategic way. The best way for me is socialism. You don't fight. Chairman Fred Hampton, Black Panther Party once said that you don't fight capitalism with black capitalism. You fight capitalism with socialism, and you fight it with solidarity. Mm. And that is the simplest formula to this. And I don't see no other way to fight it is outside of solidarity. Right now, right, the new African Panther Party with this whole coronavirus apocalypse going on, they're still outside. They're fighting against the people in power. They're still doing their free breakfast program. They're still giving all this stuff out. And even the government is like looking towards socialism a little bit, but they won't outright say it. So socialism is the way to fight this system and to really come together and give out these free programs. And for the ones on the inside, it's really sacrifice. They have the biggest sacrifices because of the lack of resources that they have already. And it's for us out here, when they take these stands, when they're doing these commissary boycotts, when they're doing these mess hall sit-ins, and all these other court crash boycotts, when they're doing all these things, it's for us to really back them. We support them financially, we support them with our words, we support them with our actions. We go to these prisons, we do phone zaps where we call up the prisons. We just wreak havoc. We constantly bombard the officials with questions and apply as much pressure as possible. That's our job out here to do, because they're on the front line, the ones on the inside. So they're gonna take the most damage, and it's for us out here to back them as strong as possible.
And I think that
answers your question.
It absolutely does. And I think that vision you're offering is both one that centers the analyses and leadership of people who are most directly impacted by state violence and white supremacy, and also is about, like you're saying, creating an analysis like socialism that capitalism can't co-opt because it's antithetical to capitalism, right? So our liberation movement,
it's impossible for that to work. And through this whole epidemic thing that's going on, I'm really seeing it that it's possible for it to work in this country. It's possible for socialism to work in this country. It's just now it's up to the people to wake up and really apply pressure and to continue. When this whole thing blows over, we have to keep this going. I just read, I don't know where the county's at, but this landlord, he just suspended the rent for the tenants all the way to August. They won't have to pay rent till September. That's power right there. That he's letting all his tenants live for free. That most people could do that. Most landlords could do that. I think we have the funds in the country to do that. So with that type of demonstration, when this blows over, we have to continue to apply pressure. Show them that we did it for a few months. We can continue to live this way and stop.
So I think it makes sense to kind of talk a little bit more about the current context, and in particular, the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis in jails and prisons. And I want to kind of forefront what abolitionists have always been saying, right, which is prisons, jails, and policing are always crises. And we've known that this was coming, right? Prisons, jails, and police have always produced crises, and in this moment, that's only becoming clearer. So I was hoping that both Kei and Jarrod could speak to a little bit about what abolitionists have to say about this current moment with COVID-19 entering prisons and jails across the country. Kei, you first.
Yeah. I think one of the important things to just talk about briefly is like Kevin's response around like wreaking havoc on the existing systems, even ongoing, and thinking even post, like here in New York, post the October 17 Bull of approval, abolitionists didn't go home. And I think that that's like one of the powerful things about having abolition as a practice, is that it doesn't stop until it actually happens. And so you can go ahead and approve this $11 billion plan, but the people are going to continue to fight. And so right now that looks like, okay, Andrew Cuomo, like we're going to actually, if you wanted to, you can close Rikers Island within 90 days. Let's actually demand and challenge that you do that. So there's just been other ways that people have been like continuing to fight back against that jail plan, while also continuing to build infrastructure. But I think that to go on that point, you know, around like abolition just not stopping despite what actually happens, is that this current moment of COVID attacking and infecting and bringing only more crisis and exhaustion to the carceral state and the systems, but most importantly, the amount of harm and death and the sacrifice of actual people, of lives, that the state, the governor, the mayor, that people who have power can actually go to sleep at night and be totally okay with it. And I think that that was one of the things that in the jail plan, before the jail plan, after the jail plan, was that abolitionists were very, very, very clear that people were playing with lives. That when you do something like commit $11 billion to a jail expansion plan, you are playing with lives. You are betting money on people's lives. And I think with COVID, abolitionists there's a lot of frustration for us. I mean, speaking for myself, there's a lot of frustration, a lot of sadness, a lot of rage at the same time of the lack of care from other people, from elected officials, those in power, to actually see the humanity, right, of people who are incarcerated. And I think that that just touches on all the different things that go back to like why reform and liberalism and etc. doesn't actually work, because when shit hits the fan, like we're seeing right now inside of these mass facilities on Rikers Island and Sing Sing, which we've already lost someone to, and that when these things happen, jails are literally the worst place to be, and that they're just so a lot of rage on like, how do you build past that, through that? How do you take care of people that you literally try to take care of on a basic basis all the time? How does Governor Cuomo have hand sanitizer being produced by prison labor and jail labor, but also just not being like, hey, you can have a gallon of hand sanitizer? It just is ridiculous and remarkable. And I don't know, Jarrod, if you want to add a little bit more around kind of the history, but also like what abolitionists are seeing in this current moment.
Sure, and you've done a lot of the work for me. I'd like to emphasize kind of one historical example as a clarifying point for some strategy. We'll start with the strategy. Prisons and jails across the country are being forced to release people. Not as many, nearly as many as we would like, right? But in this gesture, there is the tacit admission that these people did not belong in a cage in the first place, right? If, the state is not going to release somebody who is actually a threat to public safety, right? And so I think that these moments when the state is actually forced to effect kind of decarceration are opportunities for us to resist a return to the status quo, and to say, okay, 6 months from now, let's say, I hope we're out of this pandemic. Let's talk about who belongs in a cage and who doesn't, right? And so the historical example, I think, I wrote an article last week for City Limits about the mass release that took place in 1983, and you can find that easily enough. But I actually after I wrote it, I wish that I had focused on a different moment, which took place 13 years earlier, when prisoners across the city took over the various jails, the Brooklyn House of Detention, in Queens, the jail in Long Island, Rikers, and the Tombs, and so forth. And that actually, in Long Island City, the rebellious prisoners, including some folks from the Panthers, demanded that a judge come into the detention facility and hear the cases of the people who were being detained there. As the great Kwesi Balagoon later wrote, never before in the history of this racist empire has a judge been summoned to a prison to answer to the prisoners, and it was a very exciting moment. And what happened when this judge got there was that case after case was just proven to be ridiculous. Someone had a BB gun, right? The various poor people who had pissed off a cop and could not afford the bail. And actually, Bronx Borough President Herman Badillo said the judge heard 13 cases and stopped after that, because if he had heard all 460 cases, he would have had to release 400 people on the spot, because it was an entire facility filled with people for whom there was no purpose of incarcerating. And so, sorry for the kind of long-winded answer, but I think in these kinds of moments where the state has to take decarceration steps, we can really step on the gas and say, why stop there, and why ever go back to holding so many people in these squalid, dangerous cages who could just as well be at home with their families and loved ones. So I guess I would throw the question back to Kei and Nadja. Specifically, so why haven't Mayor de Blasio or Governor Cuomo undertaken the kind of radical decarceration in the face of COVID that we have seen in other places, most notably in Iran?
I think that, what's been very clear, and what, if you look at the history and the legacy of both de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo, that they have always actually done the reverse of any outward platform that they have ever mentioned. And so Bill de Blasio will tout himself as the most progressive mayor ever, which we saw on the presidential stage. When you actually look at stop and frisk, when you actually look at the rates of criminalization, when you actually look at the increase in homelessness and houselessness, when you actually look at all the things that are happening in New York City, the investment of $11 billion, which is the top #1 thing at our capital budget, and when you have the highest rate of homelessness in New York City, when you have the most segregated public schools in New York City. So if you look at the record, you'll actually see the show and the truth that the things that Bill de Blasio says is literally out of both sides of his mouth unapologetically. And I think that the same thing can be said with Cuomo, who, especially in this miss, which we just talked about, was that the bail reforms that went through just in January. So we're 3 months out of that, 4 months out officially, but that immediately after these bail reforms went into place, you had judges and DAs literally refusing to even adhere to them. You had DAs and prosecutors who were asking for bail outstandingly, even though it was against the law. You had judges blatantly saying that they weren't going to come to work because they didn't feel like they could enforce these laws. Yet the entire legal system that is structured right for justice and equality, the operators of that system actually saying absolutely not. Then you had the fear mongering, and you had the explosion of the media of these really one-off, very small micro actions of someone who may have been released, and often kind of this like random story being made up about somebody who had been released for quote unquote burglary or for shoplifting when, they're stealing a stick of deodorant. or releasing people in these different ways, that was not sustainable. And I think going back to even a little bit of what the call to action was, not just ending cash bail, but ending pretrial detention, which is why abolitionists were saying bail reforms is not enough. Especially in this jail plan, that it was always held with an asterisk. Some of the things that Bill de Blasio touted during that time is, well, we've been rapidly decreasing the jails. And if we stay on track with this, then we can reach this number and it's going to be great. When the state passes those bail reforms, which we know is going to happen, this will also decrease the jail population. And you also definitely have this weird way of wanting to solve the issues and have Rikers closed kind of as this end means and not the true acceptance and realization that there was a jail expansion plan being produced. I think that I would never request or think that Cuomo or Bill de Blasio would be invested in radical decarceration on any of those states, because that's never been who they are. I'm from upstate New York, and Cuomo is hated by Democrats because we think he's a Republican, and Republicans hate him just because they hate him. And so it's really hard to even in New York to just to rationalize or think about the possibility, which is why the call to action from organizers, from RAP has kind of been release them. We're not even going to go toe to toe. We're not even going to negotiate. We're going to tell you to release them all. We're going to demand that you close Rikers within 90 days because it's within your authority. We're not going to play this game. We're not going to play by your rules. We're not going to try to participate. We're going to go up against. And I think that it is very saddening, ironic, whatever word you want to use, to say somewhere as quote unquote popularly known that Iran is this horrible place that has horrible human rights, and you have the most popular city in the world under the most quote unquote progressive mayor with the most, democratic, Andrew Cuomo was a fanboy last week, right? He was America's sexy man, all of a sudden overnight. You have literally all these problems and beautiful things happening with a backdrop of New York City literally saying we are okay with having the tallest, biggest jails in the world. And so the reality is that I have no expectation of either of them being interested in radical decarceration, because they are upholders of the system. All of upstate New York depends on jail economy, which is also a huge problem when you have bail reforms coming into play and you have these small towns that literally exist because of the federal prison, really exist because of the county jail, losing their jobs, losing their income, losing their economy. So you have the entire, again, going back to kind of what Kev was talking about, the dismantling of capitalism as part of a requirement of abolition because of the ways in which they are intertwined together, racially, gender-wise, historically, those two things at hand, which, as we know, is a huge part of the PIC. I don't know, Jarrod, if you wanted to touch a little bit more on the lack of decarceration from Cuomo, or
if I could actually jump in for a minute, I think everything you're mentioning about de Blasio at every turn just capitulating to the police, to the NYPD, and Cuomo just capitulating to racist reactionaries who want to maintain the PIC is absolutely correct. Cuomo has had in his power to grant clemency to anyone who's currently incarcerated in New York State and has refused again and again and again clemency petitions. So this is nothing new. I think what's really revealing about this moment and really important for abolitionists is that we don't, we need to not cede any ground to carceral humanism. So when abolitionists say the prison industrial complex is genocidal, that's not a metaphor. The prison industrial complex exists to warehouse, brutalize, and murder Black and brown people. And so in this moment, when it's revealed to be doing just that, what abolitionists need to say is, yes, exactly. And then we need to be building abolitionist power with people who want to dismantle the PIC. But we can't be waiting around expecting for carceral humanists to do anything about this crisis, because the PIC is doing exactly what it's intended to do. And in this moment, we have incarcerated people across New York State rebelling against these conditions, right? And it's so important for those of us on the outside to be taking stock of and knowing those rebellions that are happening, from Rikers to Shawangunk to Sullivan to Greenhaven, people refusing to go to work, refusing to leave their cells on hunger strikes, protesting these conditions. And that's how we build power in this moment, right? As Kevin was saying, by showing up on the outside for people who are taking the biggest risks on the inside right now, and that's currently incarcerated folks. And just to emphasize this, the strike that's ongoing on Rikers is really incredible, and I hope that it leads all of us on the outside to be agitating and organizing for mass release. And as Jarrod mentions, there's a history of that in New York City, but we need to be building people power, because de Blasio and Cuomo are never going to give up state power. And so we'd just like to have Kevin speak a little bit on what he thinks organizing should look like in the context of COVID-19.
For people who want to mobilize against the prison industrial complex, in the context of COVID-19 and the impending mass deaths in jails and prisons across the country, where would you suggest that they start getting involved?
I suggest, you talking about the people on the outside or the inside?
Both.
Yeah, so the people on, concrete, I think the perfect place to start now is Rikers Island. So the people on the outside is to really target Rikers Island because of the secrecy that's going on there. Not even talking about the COVID-19, just in general, all the secrecy that's going on there. But even with this, I have one of the comrades, he has COVID-19, he has the coronavirus, and they're not even testing of us out there. I don't know how these numbers is really getting out to the public. I don't know where these numbers are coming from, but this is firsthand from a person that has it. He said they're not allowing inmates to get tested for that. He said it takes them 5, 6, 7 times to finally have them test them. But he had symptoms for weeks, and they was like, no, here, just take this ibuprofen, here, take the Theraflu, and just lay down. He had symptoms for weeks that he had it, and then finally he writes up a lot. He kept writing them up, and then they finally tested him, and he coronavirus positive. And then even that, right? They just recently, so the quarantine at a minimum was supposed to be 14 days. They released him in 6. His signs never dropped, nothing never happened. He's passed out for he's never showed progress. But they released him back into population. And that's inhumane, right? To go back to your original question about the humane jails, that's inhumane. To release him, this virus supposed to be super deadly. You release him back into population to the house that he was born to. That's ridiculous. And since there's already an amount of pressure on Rikers Island to close it and not to open up new jails, let's add on more pressure now to this COVID-19. We can add on more pressure for us out here to really dig into why they're allowing guards to not get tested, why they're allowing guards to go in there coronavirus positive, why they're allowing officials to go in there with it. They already with a death on Rikers Island from the virus. And it's just, Rikers Island have so much going on, right? They have about 5,400 men and women that don't have direct access to soap. They don't have direct access to soap. They don't have hand sanitizer, because that's illegal. They can't take showers whenever they want, but they can't do these things that the government is telling us to do, wash your hands 20 seconds, every 20 minutes. They don't have that. Right? So we have to apply that pressure, where we're going to blow Rikers up. And it's a win-win for the abolition work, because it helps the people inside there and for the reformers, right? Because that's what they want. They want the baby stuff. They want to help. They want to help make jail better. They're not making jail better, but it's going to help those inside there get the proper medical even those like up in state prisons and federal prisons, I think Rikers Island is the place where you should target. Even when I was enslaved, I would have targeted. I would have targeted Rikers Island as well. So I think everyone should target Rikers Island.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for your really thoughtful and incisive analysis. We're so grateful that you were able to give us these answers to our questions and grateful that you could participate on the panel in this way. If folks want to find more of your work, where should they look for you?
Yeah, thank you. Can you say that last one again?
If people want to find out more about you and your work with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee and the campaign to bring Mumia home, where should they look for you to find that work?
Definitely check out the campaign to bring Mumia home.org, iwalknYC.org, and I'm obviously not there, but Nadja's on the panel with me as well. So whoever wants to speak directly, like know a little bit more about my story, or just want they need help, we obviously need help in the abolition movement as well. Anything can help us. And Nadja is definitely like one of my close friends. She could get that contact and send it to me as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kevin. Have a good afternoon. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Peace.
Bye.
All right, so I'm afraid time flies when you're having fun, and we're just about at the stopping point. I guess I think the final word should go to Stevie. So we wrote to Stevie and we asked, what does abolitionist organizing mean to you? What does it feel like? How do we do it? Who do we organize with? Where do we start? What are the preeminent sites of struggle in your analysis of the current conditions of the prison industrial complex?
So I'll read Stevie's answer to this final question. To me, abolition is about new relationships, creating and sustaining healthy, mutually beneficial relationships, free of oppressive power dynamics, is a major part of abolition. Without such new relationships, we will end up replicating what we are currently fighting against. Abolitionists are required to live as if, like the world we want is here right now. It requires a commitment to prefigurative politics. We have to be the change we want to see in the world. And it starts right where we are. So many activists forget this point. We are railing against the oppression out there and standing up against the dehumanization of people out there, but in our own homes, in our own relationships, in our daily interactions, abolition is not present. These people are theoretical abolitionists. Their abolition is all theory. Where is the practice? We want to be practicing abolitionists. Our homes, our relationships, our interactions should be colored by abolitionist ethics and principles. And yes, we are all practicing. We will all make mistakes. We will all need to take accountability. We will need to repair relationships. This is all part of practicing abolition. We know that prisons occupy a large part of our struggle, but we need to be aware of carceral creep, the many ways the state is extending control, surveillance, and punishment beyond the prison walls. If we don't, we will find ourselves with new versions of incarceration, all in the name of more humane solutions to prison. This creep includes alternatives to incarceration, re-entry programs, and poverty alleviation programs sponsored by the government and nonprofit. The end result of said programs is the control and surveillance of poor people, mostly people of color.
Wow. Thank you all so much. That was, I feel energized. And I know that we've had a number of questions coming through. I think other people are energized as well. Let's see. I guess we can start with, we have a question from Dustin Gibson, and they didn't want to unmute themselves, so I'm going to ask on their behalf. directed specifically at Kei, wondering in doing research, Kei, if you came across any connections between asylums, state schools, hospitals, and prisons.
Yeah. So, I think that kind of the reality and what I was saying as well is like institutions. That entire structure, that entire framework requires there to be a warehousing of sorts of people and a kind of one size fits all, at least overseeing thing. And so if it goes from, poverty and controlling impoverished communities and controlling what they look like, etc., over into slavery, over into the carceral state. All of those things depend on, as Nadja touched on, white supremacy, oppression, anti-Blackness, and class differences, a wealth gap. It makes it so that whatever situation that you're looking at, one of the common threads there is that people are denied the things that they need to survive in whatever way that looks like. And so I think that just like the overlapping of all of those things is really important. There is a book that I really like to refer to that is by Virginia Eubanks. It's called Automating Inequality, how high-tech tools profile police and prisons basically control, but it's called Automating Inequality, how high-tech tools profiles police and punish whatever. Sorry, here we go. Automating Inequality, how high-tech tools profile police punish the poor. In that book, I've been able to really utilize as like a grounding to see the different ways in which there's an overlap between the institutions built for poverty and adoption agencies and orphanages, etc., especially in New York. Poverty houses then shift into incarceration systems. And then if I'm tying that back to the work from the 1600s and 1700s around deed theft or not allowing people to use land, or criminalization laws such as slave laws, the Lantern Law, which those things sound very much like the surveillance and probation and parole that we go through. So if you're saying to someone, you can't gather in groups larger than 2, and then you look at the new massive gang database that we have here in New York City, it's the same exact thing. People are gathering in groups larger than 2, larger than 3. They're wearing similar colors, which like culturally happens, but these are the crimes that they're committing under quote unquote the state, the same exact reality that's playing throughout across all of these threads. And so it is the denial of people being able to exist freely, to denial for them to have the things that they need in order to live and sustain themselves basically, and also the denial of this belief that you are deserving of those things, that you are deserving of clean water, that you, for some reason, as an incarcerated person, you deserve to sit inside of a cage packed with 15 other people that has not been cleaned because of whatever reason. And I think that what I consider irrationalization of humanity is super common across those completely things, those threads. And I can keep going. I'm a history geek. I could totally keep talking about this specific thing. But Automating Inequality is a great book that will kind of give you a good chunk summary of those things.
Can I jump in with an answer as well?
Yes, go.
So one of my elders is incarcerated upstate at Eastern New York Correctional Facility. And when she was transferred there, she asked me, what does the prison look like from the outside? And I could only think of metaphors, right? It looks like an asylum. It looks like a poorhouse. And those things just felt like metaphors for prison. But when I went home, I looked up Eastern New York Correctional Facility, and it turns out it was built at the end of the 19th century, was a prison. Then it was a home for troubled boys. Then it was a home for people with intellectual disabilities, and now it's a prison again. And so it's an anecdote, right? But I think it speaks to the history that Kei is talking about of these institutions operating in conjunction to control oppressed people, right? Whether that's through criminalization or other forms of institutionalization, you see prisons bleeding into asylums, turning back into prisons, turning into homes for juveniles, and then back into carceral facilities, right? And so it made me reflect on how, when I was trying to describe the outside of the prison to my elder, and I said it looked like an asylum, I meant it looked like an asylum because it looks like a prison, right?
Yeah, if I could hop onto that very quickly. At the risk of putting my students on blast, I think there's a few of them in here. This week we read Ted Conover's book, New Jack, about when he worked as a guard at Sing Sing for a year and wrote about it. And within 10 minutes, we were talking about what it's like to work at an assisted living facility for low-income people. And within 20 minutes, we were talking about what it's like to go to high school in a working class community of color. And we didn't really get to talk very much about old Ted at all, just because the facilities were just so similar. And there's just such an obvious underlying law.
Thank you all for those answers. We're going to move to a question from Christine M. Rucker. I'm going to unmute you, Christine. And
oh, great. Thank you. So I'm a volunteer creativity and art teacher at a jail in the South, and they asked me to start working in some of the halfway houses also. And with my classes, I try to target to help participants empower and heal themselves through art. And I was wondering, what ways can I do to support abolition with this type of work?
I think one of the most important things you can do is what you must already be doing, which is giving your students access to safe spaces for self-expression, to work out their experiences and analyses of what's going on for them while they're incarcerated. And as you must already know, people faced extreme repression around self-expression in prison. And you must use kind of all of the tools at your disposal to both create safe spaces in which people feel like they can talk about what they're going through and develop a kind of collective and shared analysis while doing your best to protect them from censorship. I also understand that many people like you who work in jails and prisons but are not staff of jails and prisons have many regulations on the ways in which you're allowed to interact with incarcerated people in those facilities. And so developing relationships with incarcerated people outside of the system in which you work will also be a way for you, I think, to gain some insight into fostering abolitionist analysis inside. I really wish Stevie were on the panel with us, because one of the things that Stevie does is organize abolitionist study circles inside. And so he obviously has all of the tools and strategies for doing that. And one of the things that he talks about often is the importance of zines in disseminating abolitionist ideas inside, because they're small, they can be photocopied, and they're more accessible than entire books. So maybe zines could be something that you explore with your students. I don't know if Kei or Jarrod have answers as well.
great, thanks. We're going to move to a question from TL from Heard. TL, I'm gonna unmute you now. TL, are you there? Oh, yeah, sure, I can ask. Sorry. Okay, so this is from TL from Heard. And the question is, would appreciate if panelists could discuss the importance of having a strong disability justice lens as we move abolition forward. How have anti-ableist praxis informed your efforts?
I guess I'll jump in on that in terms of disability justice and the ways in which we try to make sure that all that we do is accessible. I think that there's a lot of learning that all of us can do and need to do, especially around disabilities in general, and what we consider to be accessible for everybody is often not. And often the things that we do are the bare minimum of making sure that people have the space and the invitation and comfort in order to do so. I think that one of the things that we cannot forget about is that we are always building with those people who have those lived experiences. And one of the things about building under the practice of collaborative solidarity is that we are accepting people for their lived experiences as is and trying to make the world better for everybody. And through organizing, I think that one of the things that I always try to suggest and share is that everybody has a role, and that you utilize your role to the best of your ability and your capacity. And for some people, like Christine was just talking about, being an art therapist inside of Rikers Island or inside of a jail facility, as an organizer, you know, I do a lot of direct actions on the ground that I always try to coordinate in some other way to make sure that there's accessibility involved. I would like kind of step back a little bit more, just thinking about my role in terms of like direct actions, and more so that, and turn over this question to like Nadja.
So one of the things I've learned from HERD, right, is this analysis around how people with disabilities or disabled people are both heavily criminalized, and prisons and jails are disabling, right? They produce disabilities, they produce trauma, they produce injury, physical injury and bodily harm. And so we both need to understand how disability is criminalized, and then how the institutions in which we put people after they've been criminalized further are disabling and harming in that way. And I think a disability justice framework requires us to ask questions about what safety means for everyone, right? And to expand our understanding of organizing to encompass all of the different needs, the physical needs, the emotional needs, the neurological needs, the needs for contact, the needs for distance that we bring into the world. And rather than treating those things as separate from organizing, centering those needs as part of the world that we're trying to build, as Stevie mentions, right? As abolitionists, we have to act as though a world in which all of our complex, beautiful, strange, different needs are what make us a community, what make us able to love each other. And I think that that's really what organizations like HERD bring to the forefront of a prison abolitionist movement. And in addition to this question that we've been talking about, right, which is the ways in which institutions that are meant to criminalize people with disabilities include places like the asylum, include places like the nursing home, include places like public housing, right? And those are all part of creating a world without disability justice, without disability access.
Great. We're going to jump to Dominic now, who is a community liaison with Theater of War. Dominic, I'm going to unmute you, all right? Oh, there's my chat bar. Oh, it looks like your sound might be disabled. Let's see, do you want to try reconnecting with sound? And I'm gonna jump to Fong Bui for a second. Oh, you're connecting. Okay, cool. Dominic, you there? Oh, still nothing. Okay, I'm gonna let you work that out for a second. We're gonna go to Fong. PB, you should be good to go.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me all right? Thank you, Jarrod. Thank you, Nadja, Keith, Kevin, Stephen. It's very inspiring to hear you talk about this predicament, which remind me so much when I was growing up in Vietnam. I remember studying about French colonization, and they call Vietnamese our people. squatting monkey. I was very young, maybe no more than 5 or 6 years old. And that stuck in my head. And then I came to the US and then went to college when I was very young also. And I remember having read Foucault, Madness in Civilization. So it's about language of psychiatry. I remember modern men no longer communicate with madmen. You know, the people who once was part of our society were being marginalized. So somehow the language of psychiatry, which became a monologue by reason, by rationalization because of the age of enlightenment, 18th century, it troubled me. It troubled me like the way it troubled me now, having heard you talk about it, you all talk about it. And how do we what can we come together? And not long ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, I finished reading Brian Stevenson's book. It's called Just Mercy, a story about justice and redemption. And I memorized the phrase, one of the, sentence in it. It goes, there is strength, a power even, in understanding brokenness, because embracing our own brokenness creates a need and desire for mercy, and perhaps a corresponding need to show mercy. When you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you can't otherwise see. You hear things you can't otherwise hear. You begin to recognize the humanity that resides in each of us. So my point is, when I was in college in the early 80s, I did manage to read Malcolm X, as I did with Dr. King. There's an incredible extreme differences. And I feel the necessity now for all of us. This is why the rail is free. And it's not separating of the seven art and the humanities and our political, social lives. I think there is a profound necessity to bring us together. So I would like to ask all of you, is there a solution, promise of some sort, that we can go beyond our own specificity, specialized study and so on? In order to unify, we need to bring everyone together. It can't, the reason why the political power is good and it maintains its own power, because it has the ability to separate us. I'm talking about even academia, So let's see whether there's hope, because I'm determined. So I hope we all determined to do this. So can you just sort of respond and explore this, not ideology, but aspiration? Thank you.
And I think that, one, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for just like taking the time and the space to share that beautifulness with us. I think that this is going to be a hard answer for me, because it's not a hard question, but it's a complicated question. Some of the things that we talked about here was having people who were pro-building jails calling themselves abolitionists. How do you deal with kind of this very principled standing and understanding of what abolition is, and argue with someone that's co-opted this very principle that you've tried to embody? I think that at the end of the day, one, I have a lot of hope and belief in abolition, because I personally believe that abolition is the answer. That whenever we decide to come together, yes, Dr. King was nonviolent and practiced nonviolence, but he was definitely also very aware of the difference in the response of nonviolence practices by Gandhi and the response of the state there versus the response of the state here in the US against Black people and poor people, and that response of nonviolence. The same thing with Malcolm reaching a point of just loving and caring his people. And so I always try to say that those two, King and Malcolm, are not on different sides of the spectrum. They're in the same exact room. And what I'm seeing King do is create the theory, create the words, give people the language, give people the stories, give people the ideals and the vision. And I see Malcolm very much living that reality, ensuring that the community was taken care of. The Nation of Islam ensuring that there was safety and security, very familiar to what the Black Panthers did by creating the entire structure and the entire template of welfare feeding programs, from the breakfast food program and the after school programs, all of those methods coming together and hoping that we learn from each other. And I think that regardless of what we do, and this was really important and key, and why I love the definition of abolition given by Critical Resistance, is that we are hoping to build a world that creates safety for everybody. That at the basis of all things, that we all should just be able to be safe, be able to thrive, be able to sustain ourselves and have our loved ones around us. And that's why I believe abolition is the ultimate win. Because it doesn't force you to decide who's going to die in prison because of this, whatever, who's going to be able to eat today because they live in this area. Literally, abolition is bringing together all of those things, all the complexities of humanity, saying, yes, people, there is violence in the world. Harm is going to happen. And it sometimes, if we're looking at capitalism, harm happens by people who have the most access to everything. So it's also not just about providing resources and filling that void. It is about recreating the humanity of people, recreating the human story of being dependent upon one another. It's about taking care of one another and understanding that safety exists, most importantly, within self and within the home and your most immediate circle. And so I'm someone that definitely believes if we can just take these core principles of, yes, embodying hope and grace and positivity and faith and understanding healing, understanding that we have trauma to move through, all these different things that make up the complexity of humanity. And I'm speaking to you this way in the sense of, like, you talked about psychiatry and you talked about academia. But again, we all have a role in making this world a better place. For King, it was looking towards this more revelationary, this more vision, this speaking out to everybody. For Malcolm, it was taking care of one another, building safety, self-defense. All these mechanisms have to come together. But under abolition is that you are building the models and practicing it at the same exact time, which is why it is such a sweet, sweet thing when I think about abolition. It brings me joy to think about abolition.
I must say this, have always been my aspiration, our aspiration, the Brooklyn Rail. It's stay free. And it's always our desire to unify the love, what we care for the art and culture. When I remember coming to America and going to college and study, and I remember how touched I was in hearing the song Strength Fruit was popularized by Billie Holiday, but written by a Jewish man teaching somewhere in the Bronx. His state's name was Louis Allen, but his real name was, I believe, Abu Melrapo. There was a time when people came together. That song was written in the late 30s. Again, I heard you guys mention about the Great Depression, the 30s, the progressiveness of it all. My comment is both question and comment is that we just have to spend time together more, to hear each other more. And I commend also one of the question asking about how can we bring art therapy to prisoners and all of that. It's also very important also.
I know that Christine kind of tried to answer that question earlier, even with her own work. And I appreciate, the Brooklyn Rail and just like that entire analysis that you're presenting and trying to offer that space. I think that I do want to let us get back to Dominic since his audio is hopefully working now, and make space so that he can ask this question.
Thank you.
You're on, Dominic.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Hey, Dominic.
Great. Hey, how you doing? First, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm honored to be able to be in this space to have this conversation. I want to give a big shout out to Brian and Marjorie from Theater War Productions. They gave me my first opportunity. Just to keep things brief and to give you a little background about me. I'm currently 42 years old. I served 20 years, 7 months, and 18 days in maximum security prisons all across New York State. I received clemency from Governor Cuomo in late 2017. I was released in January 22nd of 2018. And one of the things that I think was really rich about this conversation as we think about people being quarantined, as we think about slave wages, as we think about systematic systems of oppression, who treat people who come from marginalized communities like trash. I just have to say that this conversation was really rich for me. My prison experience was different from most. I would still be in prison right now had I not received clemency. The governor should. I encourage him. I've done several articles, op-eds in the Daily News. I've done stories on NBC asking the governor to do more clemencies, to treat people who come from these communities that are not fighting for a second chance. They're really fighting for a first, an opportunity to be free. I would be in prison right now dealing with this whole pandemic, and I constantly speak to men and women who are dealing with some of these challenges now. And so I like I said, I want to thank you guys for this amazing conversation. I want to thank just the people in my life who supported me through some of these huge challenges. I spent some of my teens in prison, all of my 20s, all of my 30s, and started on my 40s. And when we have these conversations, it's reminiscent of the conversations that I used to have with myself as I sat behind this 40-foot wall, serving a life sentence in prison. And just to think that there are people out there who care and are committed to dismantling these systems of oppression. They have to be rooted out. They have to be dismantled. We can't close one down and build another pretty one for millions and millions of dollars. We can't, we talk about the state that the budget is in right now because of what's going on. We spent $3 billion on prisons in New York State. And, I would suggest that we cut some of that money out in that direction, that we would free people, that we would provide services, and that we would continue to have amazing conversations like this. In Theater War, we say that these conversations are the performance. These conversations about trauma and tragedy are the catalyst to how we begin to heal. And for me, everything starts with a conversation. It starts with a dialogue about how do we heal as a community? How do we look at people who are suffering and are dealing with terrible, terrible situations, terrible trauma, and how do we help them rebound? How do we help them figure it out? And I'm just honored, like I said, to really be able to be part of this conversation. And I would not rather spend my afternoon anywhere else but right here, being part of the solution, as it was mentioned earlier. Those who were once closest to the problem are probably closest to the solution. We have to look at individuals who have been subjected to this trauma and ask them, how do we begin the healing process? How do we take a look at what reentry really looks like, and what are we reentering back to, and how does that feel, and what does that look like? A huge part of what my afternoon was about was trying to figure out how to do a Zoom call. Marjolaine, thank you so much for walking me through this process. She's our company manager, but that's part of me being in prison for over 2 decades, and me not having a laptop and working on a cell phone and trying to walk through this process. And there are many, many other things, simple things like swiping a Metro card and, you know, never mind the big stuff like paying bills and all those other type of things, issues with family that have been not fractured, but broken because of this prison industrial complex. So I want to thank everybody for listening. Thank you so much for taking my comments. I wish, and I know that we can do more. And the question that we've often asked ourselves, and if we haven't, we should. How complicit are we? How complicit are you if we continue to allow these things to happen? So thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. Those words.
So much. Like, thank you.
Thank you, Dominic, and welcome home. We're glad to have you back.
We have a bunch more questions, but I want to just like note that we've been going for 2 hours, and panelists, how are y'all feeling? Could take a couple more. Maybe we'll take like one more, maybe one or two.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Okay, so the next one we're gonna go to. Let's see. Kabira has a question about what it would. I'll just Kabira. I'm gonna unmute if that's okay. Kabira step. Okay. Move to question Claire. Claire, I'm gonna unmute you, okay?
Oh God. Yeah. My question was, I was wondering what if the panelists could speak to domestic violence and what happens when perpetrators of domestic violence are released back to their homes.
So I'm sure you know this, Claire, and thanks for the question, but most survivors of domestic violence never call the police. Not only because they don't trust the police to address the circumstances in which they're living, but often because they're afraid of the criminalizing consequences of having called the police. Either the consequences of the person they are calling the police on, going to jail or prison, or the consequences of them themselves getting arrested. And in the wake of the Violence Against Women Act, which was passed alongside the Omnibus crime bill in 1994, many jurisdictions expanded what is called mandatory arrest policies, which in the context of domestic violence calls has meant that the police are required to arrest someone. But because of the presumption that women and survivors of domestic violence aren't allowed to defend themselves against patriarchy and defend themselves against violence, these policies have often resulted in the survivor themselves being arrested and incarcerated. And so Survived and Punished, for example, is an organization that works on the criminalization of survival, people who have fought back against people who are abusing them and are serving long sentences in prison for surviving that violence. So I take your question seriously about wanting to protect communities and wanting to protect people who are suffering from domestic violence and suffering from intimate partner violence in their homes. I don't think the police, jails, and prisons are doing a good job of protecting people from that violence. And I think there are other solutions that we could be exploring as a society that actually did the work of both protecting survivors while not exposing people who cause harm to conditions that are likely to be more brutalizing, punishing, and traumatizing, right? So that people are staying in communities with the resources they need to reduce interpersonal harm and violence. So I think domestic violence shelters, I think safe havens for people who are causing violence, right? In communities, places where people can go who have caused violence that don't subject them to the violence of incarceration could be some options that we could explore, in addition to many restorative and transformative justice projects that communities, neighborhoods, and families are already taking on to address domestic violence and some of the most extreme forms of domestic violence. So I'm thinking of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collaborative, which works on childhood sexual abuse, without resort to police prisons or jails. And I would really encourage everyone on this call to look into their work. That's the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective.
Sure, and I would just like to add to that that a lot of the scaffolding that our scholarship and organizing is built on was constructed by women, largely women of color, who were organized for decades against interpersonal violence, and a lot of the kind of canonical abolitionist theory that we all study now was written by folks who had come to the conclusion that violence is a very serious problem, but criminalization is not making it any better. It's actually making it worse by further destabilizing communities. And I think that history is actually very important, because sometimes abolitionists get accused of, being in a sort of ivory tower and not connecting their theory to the practical reality for working class people. But I think that the history demonstrates that actually a lot of this theory came out of hard-won insight from people organizing with these problems and finding the limitations of carceral solutions.
Awesome. Thank you for those answers. We're going to go one last question from Elijah. Elijah, I'm going to unmute you now, okay?
Okay. Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks to all the panelists for doing this talk. This has been very inspiring and informative. I'm coming from the perspective of a law student. I'm a first-year law student right now, and so I'm thinking about these, like, the problems of abolition in sort of a very legal way. And I was interested most by the parts of the discussion that kind of centered on the people who kind of make the justice system turn. And so my question is kind of, it's kind of annoying. It's kind of in two parts. But the first part has to do with how do we sort of create incentives on the part of judges and prosecutors, even when those people might not have abolitionist intents? Like what can we do to sort of make it practically expedient for them to release and refuse to detain people? That's sort of the first part. And then the second part is closely related, has to do with, like, how should we feel about people who claim to be like progressive prosecutors or progressive judges? What is their role in this? And can there be such a thing in this system? Should we be wary of these people? Those sorts of things.
I'm sure other folks have answers, but I don't think you're going to like mine, which is that I don't think we can create any incentives for judges and prosecutors. I just think we have to take away their power, take away their money, take away their resources, and reduce the scope of what they're allowed to do. And we do that through organizing. And in this current moment, in the context of COVID-19, there's a whole campaign in New York City and across the state to call prosecutors and judges and demand that they sign off on release orders, right? And I don't know that there's much that we can do to sway them to do the exact opposite of what their jobs are, right? Judges and prosecutors exist to criminalize, right? They're part of the criminal legal system and they're part of its machinery. And so I don't know that we get incentives. I don't know if there are incentives that we could create for them to do the opposite of what their function in the system is. I think we just have to build power so we can take away theirs. But maybe Jarrod or Kei has another answer to that question.
So, we're in hour 3 and we're letting our hair down. I mean, I consider abolitionism as part of class struggle. I mean, it's part and parcel of just the struggle of the working class to, negate itself as a class and thereby negate class society. And so any intervention, I think, should be from that vantage point. So if somebody wants to go into deep cover and get a job as a prosecutor and sabotage the mechanisms of the carceral state, you have my blessing. But unfortunately, I'm afraid that people who go into these institutions with the intention of changing them from within are often compelled by the amazing gravitational pull of these self-perpetuating institutions, and you internalize the logic. Suddenly, everything makes sense to you. I don't know if you've ever taken on a managerial function in your job. I did briefly, and it was amazing. Within a couple of weeks, I understood the need to hire and fire fairly arbitrarily, and so you kind of have to be careful about what kind of objective forces you subject your fragile consciousness to. That being said, I mean, you don't know what's going to work until you've tried it, right?
I think that I can pick up on that in the sense of like, yes, Jared, like, yes, we don't know what works until we try it, but like, as abolitionists, and as we say historically, we have tried penalization. We have tried the legal system. We have tried to do bail reform that forces judges and prosecutors, that actually puts the limitation, the legal limitation on what they are actually able to do, and to go back to Dominic's point, the complacency and the complicitness in upholding the structures that even legally they are not allowed to uphold. The same thing speaking in New York City about stop and frisk. The state will always in some way evolve or shift as long as it has the parameters to do so, to keep people powerless. And I, as someone who is very interested in law and history, I always try to look at law and things critically, in the sense that we have to go about law very, very quickly, and the awareness and the honesty and the transparency as to how laws have been used, written, created, and implemented in the United States has consistently and always been at the oppression and risk of other people. And that one, that's the requirement of capitalism, to have these different structures, different classes. It also is the requirement, again, of a lack of humanity to create these systems and spaces. That one of the things that my partner often talks about is, if you give someone a home, what does that make a homeowner, right? Like once you start to equalize the day-to-day realities of people begin to feel this risk and this sense of taking away, which is why we're in the current situation that we're in many capacities. But I think that when it comes to law, we have to be extremely critical about how those laws are written, how they're implemented, and who has the power to change those laws as quickly as they've been implemented. And I'm just speaking specifically in regards to the law frame, but there are abolitionists who go to work every single day within the legal system and try their very best to resist, to push back, to build the entities and the structures and support that's needed to turn it inside out. But overall, there has to be, yes, a chipping away of this huge blue block, but I'm also someone that believes that we can throw the entire block away and start fresh, because I'm also tired of investing in the system. So it's all around catch-22, but I think that there's an importance in us knowing our system, knowing our policy, and trying our best to reduce harm day to day in our lived experiences and for the experiences of others. And if that is the role that you are going to take when you move on to law school or etc., then take those roles, but also realizing that a lot of reasons why people remain in those positions is because it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to remain complacent. It's a lot easier to just go along with the system. It's a lot easier to say, well, I work at this big organization and like whatever. The realities of people like losing their jobs. It's complicated, but I always try to have people understand and to just like go back into what Dominic said. How complicit are you going to be?
Awesome. I think that is a great place to end. Thank you so much to our panelists. Y'all are athletes. We're at 2 hours and 15 minutes. This is amazing. The other athletes here, Cheryl, Keisha, Miko, Malvika, making this accessible. Amazing, like amazing. And thank you all. Thank you everyone who tuned in, asked questions. This was great. I love this discussion, and I hope we have the opportunity to continue it sometime soon. Thank you all very much. And
thank you, John. Thank you, Sophia, for your facilitation and coordination, and everybody else that is not known, but definitely contributed to making this happen.
Thank you, everyone. This was really positive.
Thanks for spending your Saturday evening with us, and thanks to all the work that went into
Yes.
it. It's great to spend this time with you all.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Have a good night.
This will be on YouTube, hopefully by Monday or Tuesday, for people to watch in perpetuity, and we'll include links and the transcript for people to access it. Thank you. Big thank you to 5 Miles too for being part of this original idea and for being the spiritual home of the event. It's a wonderful small nonprofit arts organization in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Bye everyone. Bye Heidi, bye Miko, bye Dominic, bye Maureen, bye Shandani, bye Lewis, bye Julia, bye Daniel. Pleasure to see so many faces.
Bye, Marjolaine. Nice to see you.